Okay, we're going to talk about a few things here relating to support department cost allocation. First and foremost, let's be clear that what we're talking about here are departments that aid and assist the productive departments in fulfilling their functions. These would be things like IT, accounting, HR, law. These are necessary activities that the operating departments have a choice. They could go out and contract or purchase these services themselves, or they can buy them from the corporation as a whole. Now, the corporation as a whole has made a decision that they feel that is cheaper and they get better quality to offer this themselves. So there's a sense they're going to make the productive departments buy these. The question is, when you use it, how do you allocate the cost of these support departments? Because what you ultimately want to ask, or the question that has to be asked, is that what does it really cost us? What's the total cost to provide this good, to manufacture this good? Not only that cost not only includes the manufacturing costs, but all of the other costs that are necessary. And one of the necessary costs to make something would be HR, would be accounting, would be IT, would be law, in different levels and different amounts, but those are important. So that's really the gist of support department cost allocation, is to come up with, again, a systematic and rational way to do it. Now, first and foremost, the first couple of questions here, look at this issue of single rate or dual rate. Now, what they're getting at here is that in any support department, let's say IT would be a good example where they're going to have a certain amount of variable cost, and that is the people who make it paid on an hourly basis. And so one way of allocating their cost might be on the basis of hours worked. Sort of simple. But now IT would also be made up of a significant amount of fixed cost, that is servers, all of the various computer equipment that's required to provide the services. Now that's a little bit more problematic in terms of allocating costs, and you're going to have to come up with something that's sort of agreeable to everybody, again, the systematic and rational. Now the single rate would say, well, let's combine the two things together. Let's put both the variable and the fixed part, and we'll come up with a way of allocating a cost. The dual rate would say, well, no, let's separate out the two. The labor part of IT we'll do on the basis of hours, and the fixed part, well, we'll come up with a way. Maybe the hours of computer time provided, okay? Something along that line, okay? So those are issues, and generally speaking, the dual rate will be a little bit more, if you will, accurate. Now, again, we're not trying to land on the moon. We're trying to come up with again, sort of a systematic and rational way to allocate these costs so that both the managers and top management know what it costs to provide a service, provide a good. Now, the three methods that, when we get beyond the dual rate and single rate, okay, we're going to look at basically three ways of allocating support department costs. First, the easiest method is the direct method. Then you have the step-down method and a reciprocal method. Now, a vast majority of companies in real life use the step-down method. It's, number one, seen as sort of a compromise between the two methods. The reciprocal method is, at least theoretically, a much more accurate way of doing it, but it's also a much more difficult and complicated way to allocate costs. Conversely, the direct method is very simple, but perhaps is a little less accurate in terms of how you go about or the amount of cost that would be allocated. And so we'll look at this. Now, the reciprocal method, when we get to that, I'll talk about essentially what you'll need to know how to do when you go to allocate it. So we're going to look at basically the direct and the step-down method, spend a little bit more time with that, a little bit with the reciprocal method to a certain point. As I said, the reciprocal method is usually seen as being the most accurate and therefore is the most defensible. Now, kind of a separate issue, and I think this is maybe a little bit better explained by looking at some examples here. How do you allocate common cost? So that's essentially what 15.9 is. So, for example, if I am an attorney, working out of my home, and I have several clients that I need to go and talk to in various cities. One option I have is to fly, say, from my home, let's say in Duluth to Chicago. I can fly back. Then I could fly to Dallas and back. I could fly to New York and back. Or somehow I could kind of combine all of those into one trip. Fly from here to Chicago, Chicago to New York to Dallas, and back to Duluth. Okay, and I might choose to do that because it would be less expensive to package it together. So the question is, how would I allocate that reduced cost to my 3 clients? And we'll look at that. The so-called standalone or proportional method is perhaps the easiest way to do it. You can also use what's called the incremental method or perhaps a Shapley method. And as I said, we'll look at this more in a couple of minutes here, looking at an actual example rather than trying to talk about it in terms of generalities. All right. Okay, well, we're going to take a look at problem number 19, which in your textbook has a little bit of a graph there or a table showing how the total cost. Now, there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. First, that each department, AS and IS here, have their own direct costs. These are costs that I can attribute directly to each of these support departments. Likewise, government and corporate, these are my so-called productive departments. So what I'm trying to do is to move all of these costs into these 2 support departments, into these 2 so-called productive departments. Now, again, you have to be kind of clear about what is direct and what is allocated. All of the support department costs will eventually be allocated to the productive departments. So along the way, we'll have the direct plus allocated. So this would be the direct cost, which would also be allocated, and then again the total cost. So the total of government would be its own direct cost plus what it picked up from the support departments. Okay, now I'm looking at the direct method. We're not going to particularly worry about the amount of direct costs that are already in government and the corporate side of it. The government has $8,756,000 of direct cost. The corporate has $12,452,000. But again, those are kind of irrelevant to the question of how do I go about allocating the support department costs under the two different methods. Well, first is the direct method, and the direct method is fairly straightforward. And that is, I'm going to take, for example, all of AS, and I'm going to allocate it, that is administrative services. I'm going to take that $600,000 and take it directly to the 2 productive departments. I'm going to bypass. I'm not going to allocate any of it to the information services. That's what, hence the term direct. I take it directly to that. And I'm going to use it based on the proportions. And what they tell you is that administrative services does it on the basis of employees that are working for or working on particular tasks. So for example, 25% of its activities or its employees are employed to help IS. 40% are employed to help government. 35% are employed to do that. Now with the direct method, I ignore that 25% here. And I'm going to take the 40 and the 35 added up and then proportionalize it. Okay, and then essentially do the same thing with the information services, that this is being done on the basis of computer time, that IS provides about 10% of its work to administrative services, 30% to government, and 60% to corporate. So now in this particular case, we're going to ignore the 10% over here, like we did over here. We're not going to recognize any sharing of costs between the support departments, which is theoretically one of the weaknesses of the direct method, and take those again directly to, if you will, the productive departments. So again, based on the number of computer hours that are in the productive departments, 30 and 60, 1/3, 2/3 of the 2.4 million get allocated. So the total amount of costs, the support department costs that are allocated to government would be the 1.12 million and 1.88 under the direct method. Now remember, it's not that the direct method is inherently bad, okay, but generally you give up a degree of accuracy with simplicity. But the question is, how much do I really give up, and how much am I willing to give up? Now, the step-down method does in fact recognize a certain amount of shared cost, and that is that I can assume, let's assume that we're going to make a choice here. We're going to allocate administrative services first. So we're going to assume that when we go to allocate its direct cost, that we go back to these original percentages that you were given in the problem, the 25, 40, and 35%. So 25% of that cost is going to get allocated to information services, 40% to government, and the remaining 35% to corporate. And we're done. Okay, at that point, nothing flows back. Now, when I go to allocate my information services, I need to take the total cost. That is the 2.5 that are there, and I also need to add, if you will, the 150,000 of allocated cost. So again, the terminology is kind of important. The direct plus the allocated gives me the 2,550,000. And just like I did under the step-down method, excuse me, under the direct method, I take those directly across to the two productive departments. And so the total amount of allocated costs from the service departments under this method, where I choose to allocate administrative services first, would be the 1,090,000 and the 1,910,000. Slightly different, okay, but not hugely different, but slightly different. Now I could also choose, and the choice of which department to allocate first is an arbitrary one. I mean, the book will talk about, well, do we do it on percentage basis, dollar basis, whatever. Keep in mind, no matter what I choose, it is an arbitrary choice. So in this case, they choose to allocate the information services first. And so in this case, I'm going to kind of reverse the order. We're going to take that 2.4 million, 10% of it flows back to the administrative services, and 30 and 60% of it go to the two productive departments. So now, okay, I'm finished. I have nothing left. I want to zero both of these out, okay? So all 2.4 million has been allocated, but now I need to allocate the remaining support department. So it has its direct cost of 600,000 plus the 240,000 that was allocated to it. So it has a total of 840,000. Which now get allocated just like we did under the direct method, the 40 over 75 and the 35 over 75. So I'll allocate the 448,000 and 392,000 for a total of 1,168,000 under government, 1,832,000. And you can see here that the nice little comparison here under the three options that I have. The two step-down methods are completely arbitrary which way I go. The direct method, there's really only a $78,000 difference between the methods, which, you know, if you're talking in terms of, it's about 7%. Is it material? Kind of meets the basic criteria being material, something greater than 5%. But again, if my objective is simply to get a systematic and rational way to come up with a fair cost estimate, I'm not sure that one method is necessarily better than another. Okay? I might have more confidence in one of the step-down methods as being perhaps a little bit more accurate because it does recognize the shared cost between support departments. But again, the choice of which one I allocate first is completely arbitrary. So companies will often kind of run the numbers periodically, but then they choose. Now, the step-down method also has sort of another virtue to it. And more so when you have 8, 9, 10, 12, any number of support departments. When you begin to have a situation like that, you would like to have some degree of accuracy, but you also want to avoid sort of the mathematical morass of trying to do simultaneous equations with 10 or 15 different support departments. So the step-down method works very nicely where the company will go and say, this is the order in which we're going to allocate the cost. That's set periodically, and so we just go through as cost accountants and allocate it. I don't have to do the reciprocal method. It's already done for me in terms of the company's making a decision. So in that sense, between these three different methods, $78,000 difference, take your choice. It really doesn't matter. Okay, the third part of the question gets at this issue. Well, if we're going to use the step-down method, which way do we go? Okay, well, there are three different ways that you can argue. One would be based on the percentage of work that I do for the other department. Okay, allocate first the one that has provides the highest proportion of its services to the other department, or has the greatest dollar figure, or provides the most in terms of dollar figures to the other. So there are three different methods that you can use here to rationalize a choice. But no matter what you do, it still comes back to a little bit of an arbitrary decision. You're just perhaps a little bit more comfortable with it. All right, the reciprocal method is designed to recognize a couple of things. One, that there is a mutual sharing of cost between the service departments, okay, that goes on simultaneously. It's not just a one-time thing that happens at the end of the year. And so not only is there sharing of cost here, but there's also this kind of allocation of cost that goes over to the productive departments. Now, there are two different ways that you can do this. And in our case, what you're going to need to know how to do would be what I've set up here to create these so-called equations. Now, remember, I talked in terms of direct and allocated cost. So when I talk in terms of administrative services has $600,000 of its own direct cost. Information services likewise has $240,000 of its own administrative cost. Okay? But in addition to that, administrative services picks up 10% of information services. In other words, information services does 10% of its work for administrative services. So in a sense, administrative services should be paying for 10% of information services cost. Likewise, administrative services provides about 25% of its work for information services. So when I talk in terms of total cost for administrative services, I really should be looking in terms of talking in terms of this total cost of $2.4 million plus the 25% of the cost there. So this is really what you're going to need to know how to do. This is what I will test you on. Beyond this point, when I get down into this part here, what I'm doing is really setting up and solving the equations. And that's fine, you can do that. But really what I want you to be able to do is not so much solve the equations, but rather set it up. I said, okay, I really don't want this to be an algebra class. I would prefer for it to be a cost accounting class. Now, if I look at this, I can choose to solve either of the equations. In this case, they decided to solve information services. So I insert, okay, whoops, keep getting these things okay. If the administrative services in here, and so everything is in terms of IS. Solve for that, and IS ends up being the total cost, the direct plus the part that gets allocated to it, the 2.615 million. Okay, the 2.4 million plus the allocated cost that came to it, a little over 200,000. Then plug that in over here to administrative services. I have it. So in essence, really what you're going to need to know how to do is this thing right here. Set up the equations. You need to know conceptually what is the reciprocal method, but likewise too, you need to know how to set up the simultaneous equations. If you can get to that point, and then I'm assuming that you can solve for it. Now, the other methods you have of solving for simultaneous equations or solving for the reciprocal method is sometimes called the iterative method, which looks kind of clunky, but actually is fairly easy to do. It's just a little bit more, involves a little bit more mathematics, but not as complicated as math. So what it is just a series of doing step-down methods. So it doesn't matter which one I choose to do. this case, they choose to allocate administrative services first. Then what I want to do is take the total cost, and it's going to flow back into AS, and then do it again. Okay, and each time this cost kind of flows back. So I'm essentially, through a series, eliminating, throwing more and more costs into the productive departments. Okay, and so with each iteration here, this gets down to be pretty close to zero. Now, at some point, at the end of the fourth, okay, you could get to the fourth and say, geez, we've got 160 left. How about if we just share the 160 between us? Would it make that big of a difference? Absolutely not. In this case, they went to, and you make the choice. At what point do I stop? At what dollar figure do I stop and just say, hey, I'll take the 160, we'll split it between the two departments, or we'll do it proportionally, and we're done. Kind of like the direct method. In this case, they went to a fifth iteration. Okay, is it more accurate? Well, if I were to give you two numbers, okay, and these numbers here compare with something that might be $160 difference, you really wouldn't be able to tell me the difference. So from a materiality point of view, you reach this point and say, hey, we're done. Okay, 160, that's it. And what they're showing you here is that, again, between the four different methods, the direct, the two different ways of doing step down, and reciprocal method, really not a whole lot of difference, 78,000 difference, okay? And so from a materiality point of view, you could argue, does it really matter? And so if there's really not a huge difference here, that's why a lot of companies will choose to do the step down method, primarily because they see it as a compromise between the direct and reciprocal method. And particularly if I have more than two support departments, I don't have the complication of solving something like this, like I would with reciprocal method, with more than two departments. So, and I think 75–80% of the companies that do support cost allocation will use the reciprocal method. All right, one final problem, if you will, or issue in this chapter is this problem of how do I allocate common cost or recognize common revenues? And the dilemma you have here is that if Barbara makes two different flights, okay, she's going to pay $2,000. It would cost $1,200 to fly to Baltimore and back to her place, okay, in California. And then if she flies to Chicago, that's going to be $800, a total of $1,200. However, she's found that if she kind of packages both of them, okay, together in making one big trip, that she can effect a substantial savings, go from $2,000 to $1,600. So the question is, okay, how do I fairly allocate those costs to my clients? Well, one is called the standalone, which is, I like to call it the proportional method. Let's just take, I know that the sum of my total costs, if I do them individually, is $2,000. Well, proportionally, what are each of the components? Well, 1,200 over 2,000, okay, times 1,600 gives me 960. 800 over 2,000 gives me, times 1,600 gives me 640. Again, fair, rational, and your clients will, number one, like it because they're saving money, and number two, they're going to see it as fair, and they're not being penalized. So it has several advantages, the standalone and proportional method. One is very clear to understand precisely what you're doing. Very clear, very easy to do it, very easy to understand. And the perception from most people, 99% of the people, is that, oh, this is fair, I'm not going to argue with this. Because number one, we're saving money, they're not charging as much as they could, and the way they went about doing it is inherently fair. So that's really it is not complicated. The standalone or the proportional method is very simple to do. Now, the incremental method, on the other hand, is probably not something that you want to disclose to your clients because they're going to see it as inherently unfair, at least some of them. And the incremental method says you pick number one client and you start allocating cost. So if I pick Baltimore client as being number one, okay, I will allocate out of that 1,600, they pick up 1,200. What's remaining, I'm going to allocate to my Chicago client. Okay, now you can read here why I might do that. but I can guarantee you, you do not want to be disclosing this sort of information to your client. So I would bill my Baltimore client for $1,200. Okay, if they don't know what I'm doing, they don't really care. Okay, I could say, oh yeah, it would have cost them $1,200. The Chicago client's going to be happy because hey, they save $400. That's great. So now I could also do reverse the order. And that's one of the inherent problems or challenges with this. I can allocate it to my Chicago client first. They pick up all $800, okay, what they normally would have paid. What's remaining then is going to get allocated to my Baltimore client. Now again, part of it is internally, why do I want to do it? And that's kind of what they explain here in these two little paragraphs after each of these allocations. As I said, the incremental method is, there are some internal decision-making reasons why I might want to use it, but I would certainly never want to disclose it to the client. Now, the Shapley method is seen as sort of a averaging of my incremental methods. So, for example, my Baltimore client was allocated $800, $1,200, okay, a total of $2,000. If I divide that by 2, okay, I'm going to charge them $1,000. Chicago got 4 and 8 or 12. Divide that so they get $600. So all $1,600 gets allocated. Are they fair? Yeah, each of them. I mean, you get $200 on it. Each of them. It's sort of a little bit like the standalone method, but after I've done the incremental method. Now the problem is if I had 3 or 4, it gets a little bit cumbersome to do. But if you're going to do the Shapley method, I mean, it's good. It's probably considered the most accurate, the most fair way of doing things. But in some ways, you're really not gaining a whole lot over and above what you would do with the standalone or proportional method. So the standalone or proportional method is often the favored method, not only for allocating revenues, but allocating cost, because it's simple, it's easy to understand. Both clients and people within the company are going to say that it's inherently fair. And so from a political point of view, you're not going to get any pushback on using the standalone or the proportional method.